Okay, so for our final presentation here in track 2 of ConVerge, we have Charles Herring presenting Process, the Salvation of Incident Response. So over to you, Charles.
That's actually great. I want you to do the whole thing. Your voice is way better than mine. Yeah, I like that. All right, so thank you for picking 5 o'clock in the afternoon to talk about flowcharts. God bless you guys.
Wait, flowcharts?
There are flowcharts. Don't leave. Don't leave. There will be free beer at where are we going?
The Whitney.
The Whitney.
Yeah.
There's a flowchart. Did you complete the presentation? Yes. Go to Whitney. So a little bit of my background and how I got to this talk. So my job currently has nothing to do with process, but right out of high school I joined the Navy, enlisted in the Navy, and was trained as an aviation electronics technician working on F-18s. And in naval air warfare, naval air warfare, what is it? Let's just take a pause in this conversation and think about that for a second. In naval air combat, what we have is very well documented processes in a manual called NATOPS. And they say NATOPS is written in blood because every time there's a process failure, someone didn't do something, or the process was flawed, we lose life or limb or a lot of money or create wars, those types of things. So I was very disappointed.
Hello folks, I'm Geek here. It seems that Detroit does not necessarily like my video rigs and had some more technical difficulties. It froze up, but audio and the speaker moving about will resume again at about the 4-minute 23-second mark. Sorry for the problems.
Different languages. Operators are infinitely frustrated that their managers are either spineless, stupid, or aren't listening, whatever. But there's a communication breakdown that process can assist in. And I think most importantly, staffing InfoSec teams is the big one. It's very expensive to hire a guy that can do all kinds of foo, have the whole full skill set to do complicated and routine work. SO process can help you address that. So those are the three areas I'm looking at solving by the end of this. And by the way, there's so few of you in here that you don't even have to raise your hand. You can just say, hey, Charles, like we're sitting at the bar. Actually, we should have done this at the bar. This would have been a good place to do this. So the reason it's a problem is when we start executive level or security managers come up with InfoSec policies, cybersecurity policies of some sort. And these may be well documented. People get hired along the way that are supposed to implement the policy. Tools are purchased to deal with, to help the people, but we skip the process, which is actually the connective tissue between all of this. It's the, how do we do this? You know, how do we make sure the email is encrypted? How do we make sure that data is not lost, that malware is detected, that is responded to? And so because we skip this and we assume the people we hire know how to do it, there's the cascading effect. And in many organizations, it looks like this. Thing happened. Did our crazy hodgepodge of tools block it? If no, do foo, right? The smart guy's going to go in and do some ad hoc process, and he may or may not get it. And of course, the challenge with that is that's hard to teach. It's also very difficult to audit or to automate. So as we go through and we look at a better way of doing this, by the time we leave today, oh, and by the way, on this link down here, I should have said earlier, there's the Visio templates are available if you want to download them. It's fishbone.com/converge 2015, whatever year it is. But you can download it. This PowerPoint deck is in there along with the Visio templates that we're going to go through. So this is a high-level process document that applies to an entire organization. So I do a lot of these. I just completed one for a large manufacturer a couple of weeks ago. And it's just high-level blocks, and each one of these will have more granular flow charts that the individuals will do. But this level, I want to look at it. Any incident that's happening, how are we detecting it? How are we responding to it? And how are we measuring it? Measuring it. So the first thing that we do to make these things happen. So right now we're just going to dive right into how to make this thing Monday. The first thing is the interview. And what we do is we get the operators in here. We don't really need managers unless they're technical enough to understand what the process is. These are the guys actually doing things. The first one of these I did for a major hospital in Chicago, and I asked the guys, what do you do when there's a malware infection? They said, well, we quarantine the machine, we pull it off the network, we grab a forensic image of the memory and the disk, we start going through memory forensic. I'm like, whoa, wait a second, I know you guys can barely do algebra, you're not doing memory forensics, and even if you could, it would take all of your time, like times 10,000. You do not have the time to do that, so why are you lying to me? You know, tell me, what are you actually doing? But you want to ask them honestly, have an open dialogue on what are we really doing? What could we do, but also documenting what are we actually doing. Block off 2 or 3 hours, have a moderator who's going to run through the questions I'm going to put up here in a second, have someone taking notes of the whole thing, what's the feedback we're getting, try to keep it open. Food is code for beer, and then whiteboards for drawing some of this stuff out. So in general, when we look at the questions, it's just asking, how do we block things? How do we keep bad things from happening? When bad things do get in, how do we detect them? How do we determine the impact? And so if you're going to do investigations, it's pretty important. If I come home, if I get back to Chicago tonight and my house has been broken into, I can see it because the door's broken open. I detected that it's broken. But the impact is going to be, did they get my dive gear? Did they get my computer? You know, what did they steal, right? What's the impact of the breach? And we need to do that inside of investigations instead of just wiping the machine. If we have malware, it's not just an administrative burden. It is a bad guy is inside your network. Something bad is inside. What did it do? Did it communicate with in-scope servers, HIPAA data, patient data, PCI data, M&A data? What is the impact of it? How do we figure out how bad it is? How do we do retro-analysis? So after you arrest the guy that broke into my house, you probably want to know, is this the first time that he has done this, or is this an ongoing problem? Same thing in incidents, whether it's insiders, is this the first time this insider's stolen the data, or is this a habitual problem they've been doing over years? If it's malware, is this the first machine that's been on inside of our network, or has this been going on for 6 months and this is only the first time we've figured out, we've discovered it? And then finally, how do we wrap this up into actionable reports? We don't have time to read reports, but reports that are useful, and at what level do they go? When is the board of directors notified? And documenting these things ahead of time. So again, this isn't planning. There's no wrong answers, and when you do this, it's going to be pathetic. Whatever the answers are, it's always pathetic. That's okay. It's pathetic everywhere. It's not a competition. It's okay to be pathetic at this point. So on the detection piece, we look at, these are the exact questions I ask. How do we catch known malware? Things that there are AV signatures for, or there's IPS signatures for them. How do we know it when they actually make it into the network? Either someone bringing in a thumb drive or somebody downloading something. How do we actually catch that? What are the mechanisms? So most organizations are going to have some level of coverage on this, whether it's an antivirus agent on the endpoints or something along that line. How do we catch 0 day? So it comes into the network, there's no signature, and then we discover later on that it's malware. So either through sandboxing or the signature gets published. So it's not known today, it infects our machine, we discover it 30 days later or 10 days later that it's actually malware. How do we become aware of that? How do we become aware that malware made it in? Indicators of compromise. So there's tons of there are many global threat lists that are out there now with bad URLs that come up. How do we check to see if we connected to those URLs or made DNS queries against bad domains? How do we see that happening? And those are really symptoms. When a machine is infected, it'll begin giving off these symptoms, communicating with bad places in the world. Network behaviors. How do we detect a machine scanning the network or sending bad flag sequences or breaking through segmentation? If a machine is breaking out of scope, how do we detect those known bad behaviors that should never happen? Network anomalies, things like we saw someone yesterday. I was in Minneapolis, and a hospital had 103 gigs of data, downloaded to one machine over 6 hours, a workstation machine. Okay, could be okay. They're tasing people right now until they cough up the information, but it's an anomaly. That's not the normal amount. The normal amount would be somewhere closer to maybe 10 megs for a workstation in a given network. So how do we detect those weird things happening inside the network? And then, so once you do all that, you want to download for the metrics we're going to look at. Ask them how do they do that. They'll say it's McAfee AV. We're using FireEye for sandboxing, or whatever the things are. And then you go and pick a month, a period. It could be longer, but pick a month normally, and then take the logs from these things and figure out how many of them are there. How many of these things made it in? What do our current metrics look like? Second part of the interview is looking at response. Okay, something's happened. What do we do, right? So my question to the hospital. So first of all, how do we get a machine off the network? If it's a problem, if it's infected, how do we quarantine it and keep it from infecting other machines? What is our current process? Some places it's a taser. Some places it's pulling the plug out of the wall. Could be network access control like Cisco's Identity Services Engine. But all you want to document here is how long does it take and what tools do we use to do it. How do we find out that a compromised machine or a compromised user, what did it do on the network? What servers did it communicate with? What data did it access? How do we determine that? What's the process? And keep in mind when you're asking these questions, you're asking them for if it was ideal, what would we do? Because what we're going to find in the math is doing all of these things is mathematically impossible in most organizations given their current tool set, people, and process. But just how would we do it? How would we determine that? How would we look? If we see a bad network behavior, how do we pivot that down to the actual malware type? So if we see scanning going on in the network, was it a user that downloaded or is doing a manual nmap scan, or is it a piece of malware that is automating worm propagation? So how do you get from we see the network behavior down to the file? The next is retro flow analysis, which means if we see a network behavior that's new, like POS machines that are uploading to HVAC servers, and we know that that's a new type. an indicator of a specific type of compromise, how do we look to see how many times in the past this type of communications occurred? And then retrofile analysis. If a file hash or a file becomes known bad, how do we look back in the past and look at look for how many other times we've seen this file on the network, whether it's by pushing down antivirus signatures or using something like SourceFire's FireAmp. And so all you have to do here is document what tools are used and how long does it take in man hours, and the probability of data completeness. And so when I talk about data completeness, the top shows if you're going to go through the trouble of doing an investigation, you should be able to have useful information. There's no reason to go through a whole lot of hassle and be no better off than you were before. And so the stuff in green here, host A connected to Ukrainian host B at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of January. That's going to be some connection log, whether that's a proxy log or a NetFlow tool or PCAP data. There's going to be some tool that you do for flow analysis on impact analysis that will tell you that. It downloaded and executed an unknown type of malware that was later classified as malware.abc, right? So there's some sandboxing or zero-day technology that's going to resolve that for you. That's going to say, I saw that file hash. 4 days later, it became apparent that that was of a particular malware type. Then you're going to determine impact again. Upon compromise, that host began recon of the network, infected 4 other machines, downloaded 1.3 gig of traffic, and then uploaded it to Eastern Europe. And by the way, this is actually a real thing. This actually really happened not too long ago, May. Retroanalysis revealed that 6 other machines had been compromised on the network in a similar manner. So this is retro flow analysis. When did we see these types of communications? Like, who else has talked to this Ukrainian server? Where have we seen these types of downloads? Is the host, the file servers that were collected, when have we seen that? That's retro flow analysis. Then retro file analysis would be that malware that was executed, how many other machines have artifacts on those. And then finally, down to the user level, here's the user. He didn't do it on purpose. The user was John Doe. He was unintentional. We're going to put him through training again. So that's completeness. So when we look at, you'll see some percentages we look at in a second. If I go through and do all of the work of going through every server in the network, what are the chances I can answer these questions if I do the entire process? And so we'll look at that. But this is what that current organization could say. Host A was infected. Don't know when. We can't figure out what it did when it was infected, and we don't know if it's the first time or if it's going on over and over again, right? So this is a very common reality. So you have the data, you've been through the interview, it was fun, have happy hour afterwards, and we'll look at the blocks. But I have 3 colors on the flow chart. The first one's blue, which is blocking or before an attack occurs. The orange represents detection or during. So how do you detect it if it wasn't blocked? And then green is the investigative process. And so if you look where it says credential abuse and malware, that's the type of thing we're trying to detect. That number is how many, when you go through the log, that we saw in the monitored period. So there were 10 AV signatures on 10 different machines infected with malware in a month. And then over here, this is determining impact, right? How did the process we go through to figure out who talked to who, what data was exchanged, how long it took, and this is actually a real number, 30 hours to go through every log and figure out, find the data, and they only had a 40% chance of finding what they actually were looking for. So that's a big waste of time for them. Blocking is pretty straightforward. In process, what you're going to do, we'll talk about this when we look at the ramifications of this with vendors, but this really isn't so important what's blocking what, because you already own it. It's either blocking or it's not. When we look at how to use the process to evaluate vendor tools, we'll look at this a little bit deeper. But the only thing you need to know is the things that were detected and the things that you can't detect are add up to the past value. So you're saying, okay, how do I figure out what I can't detect? You have to make that one up. Or you get a vendor to come in with a tool that can detect something, and do a proof of concept or an assessment or something like that, you get the number from that, and you use that in these conversations. When I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, I would write monthly what I called failure reports. Here are all the things that I could that came into the network that I could not investigate because I either did not have the people, the policy, or the tools to do it. And then I would say, here are the types of threats that I can't detect because of the same, and based upon industry metrics or our testing that we did, we expect that volume to be X. And so we plug that in here. It's the total number of things that are entering our network. And this is pretty high. I was surprised. I do a lot of combined assessments with Cisco Security and partners where we go in and we put in tools and we look at what's going on in the network and take a picture of the network and generate this type of data for customers. But it's alarming how many things come into the network. You cannot block all of it. It's not, and you guys know that being here, but it's a pretty high number in almost all organizations that I've been in. Detection on the orange blocks. So the thing to keep in mind here is the stuff at the top is the easiest, cheapest technology. AV blocking something is a lot less sophisticated, expensive, dangerous than trying to do network behavioral anomaly detection or sandbox detection. It's mathematically cheaper, it's process-wise cheaper. If you get an alarm out of that, it's going to say the malware is XYZ. It was written by Charles Herring when he was a kid, and these are, Symantec calls it, just all kinds of documentation. Very easy to do an investigation at that level. And you want, at that part of the funnel, you want it doing most of the detection. But all you're going to do there is plug in whatever the tool is, McAfee and QRadar. Right? QRadar is looking for brute force authentications and maybe some other things. McAfee's looking for AV signature matches. You might also have content filtering that's doing some of that. But these are the ones not blocked, either making it all the way to the endpoint. The ones making it all the way to the endpoint. Next thing on zero-day, just plugging in here how many zero-day detections are detected with that tool that's doing it, whether it's FireEye or FireAmp or FireFire or whatever these things are called. And normally this is going to be sandbox detection here. So this means the file came in, it was later detected. It could also be AV, right? Some AV, standard AV agents are doing that as well, but how many of those are we detecting? Global threat data, so URLs that become known as bad. How do we go back and look for that global threat data for that URL? We know that badguy.com is now a URL. How do we find out when our hosts start talking to badguy.com? Those symptoms coming out of the machines. This is actually this block. I should have taken out social media detection, but APT detection, and I hate that word. I actually have a whole blog entry on why I don't ever say APT, and I just said it twice. But how do we catch targeted threats, sophisticated threats that may or may not involve malware? The organization I put social media in here is a big brand that they have people looking for chatter on the internet in the IRC rooms inside of social media where people are talking about an imminent attack, and they're looking for messaging that's going to occur. It's one way of doing it. Also looking for anomalous traffic on the network, maybe the water cooler, what people are saying inside. A lot of time targeted threats are going to involve insiders. I was working with a manufacturer in Wisconsin earlier in the year, and they are in the business, as most manufacturers are, of acquiring smaller companies for their patents, for their processes, for their technology, as they continue to grow and innovate. And if what one of the acquisition targets was doing was bribing one of the administrative assistants to provide data on the acquisition, which gave them a leg up. So the way that was detected was a similar type of thing. An anomalous amount of data coming from anomalous sources were going down to that assistant's machine. And same thing with insider. If you actually have an insiders don't need malware. They have something called credentials. So it's the best kind of malware ever. They can just go in and take whatever they want. So how do you actually watch these guys from stealing data or bringing down the network? So again, you just plug in whatever you have for the numbers. And then same thing on incident response. How do we quarantine it? Right. So how efficient is our process? If you're running a clean tool, you probably have at least a 30% recurrence rate where the machine just flags again later. If you wipe the machine, it's probably closer to 100%, but how long does it take in man hours to do that? After you do that, up in the B1 up at the top, you have determining impact. How do I look? We know that machine was infected or that user was dirty. How do we look at every communication that user did inside the network? It could be a packet capture. It could be net flow forensics. That's one of the things that I peddle. But how do we, it could be looking at all the log files, doing something into like QRadar or Logarithm or ArcSight and looking for every single access record. That might be another way. But the percentage is how thorough is that collection. If you're only doing PCAP at a couple places in the network, it's whatever that percentage of visibility is. Retroanalysis of communication, again, if you find staging, how long does it take us to do that same analysis in the past? Were there any other uploads from POS machines to HVAC? How long does it take? What's the thoroughness? That shouldn't be 30 minutes here. Flow to file. So if you see a communication on the network, how do you get into that machine and figure out what file's doing it or what's causing the behavior? The old school way of doing this is taking a forensic image of the memory and the hard drive and looking at it there, right? What file is actually putting that stuff on the network stack? So it's full-blown forensics. We have agents now that do it. I know FireAmp Endpoint does it for SourceFire. There's others. Encase has an agent, forensic agent, that can historically look at, log these behaviors into a server. And then log analysis, going through the logs. So those are the things, and you just plug in all those numbers, and then you just add them all up. And this is, finally, we're getting to the point, I promise. But I'm making flowcharts pretty exciting for today. So the block numbers is up there. How many events did we not block? That's the same number as the events detected and not detected. The completeness, you just do the average on all these, and then you add up the total time for each one of those green blocks. If we're going to do everything right every time, it might take us, how many minutes? 60. How many hours? And then we go over to the block on the left. And we just plug those things in there. And so I'll show you what it looks like and actually have some real data here. So when we're starting to apply this, the box on the top is what it was. This is actually this is a Fortune 100 company, sadly, at the top. And it has in there how many things they are currently, how many events are currently detecting, how many they're not detecting. And it takes them, if you see this, if they were to do the full investigation, it would take them 69 man hours to do one investigation. And they have 285 of those to do every month. So if you do the math there, if there's 160 man hours per FTE, they need 123 FTE to do that. And so obviously something needs to change because even this group's not big enough to staff that. And so in this scenario down here, we took in a stack of different tools from different vendors to address these deficiencies. And so for the vendor was then able to say, the group, the partner, and everyone was able to say the blocked events improved by 68%, FTE reduction from 123%, which is virtually impossible, to 9 requisite FTE, and detection accuracy improved from 49 to 99%. And so this is a bottom line business impact that should be a part of every assessment. It's not that we like the tool or that Gartner says we need the tool or compliance requires us to have the tool. It's that if we buy whatever this stuff is, it's going to impact it. And the inverse is also true. If you come through and it doesn't matter how cool the tool is or how needed it is, if it doesn't change the blue block, it's a waste of money, right? And so if you're at the manager level or the analyst level, whatever you are, you can take this and make a business justification on why you need the tool. As a vendor, you need to talk on this. Matter of fact, if the tool either has to reduce the number of events coming into the network, and that's you should do that. That's the best return anytime. And I'm saying that as a guy that sells a tool that can't block anything. But if you can reduce the number of events, it's always going to be a huge change. It needs to improve detection. In this case, these guys were detecting 1 out of 2 breaches. That's pretty bad. That's getting robbed every day and only noticing half the time. That's pretty lame. You need to at least know you're getting robbed, even if you can't stop it. And then it needs to reduce response times. So this one, 69 hours, came down to 15 hours with the new tool stack, right? And so that's important. These kind of conversations with vendors are much better than saying, you know, my tool is better than his tool and blah, blah. There's no reason to have that conversation. It needs to impact the blue block, and you just go through and have, here's our current flow chart, here's the proposed flow chart with a new set of vendor tools. And obviously from that, you're probably already picking up that it becomes a lot easier to go up to the executive or to the board. Some of the data we had there went up to the board of directors, and we went through a simplified deck on the findings and all of that to justify why we need it. If you've ever been an operator that's desperate to have tools because you need them to do your job, in most organizations, when I hear operators talking to managers, the manager hears he wants a new toy. He thinks it's shiny, he likes it, right? And that's being able to move that conversation to, no, really, or you can hire 50 more of me, right? Let's reduce cost. There's something going on here. I can reduce risk, I can reduce cost, here's the numbers. Just let's run through that. And also, if you need to get more technical, you can go back to the block and talk about why maybe it doesn't even matter to do sandboxing, right? There are some scenarios in given businesses where different blocks or maybe anomaly detection isn't so important because of something else. If you go through the whole math and it seems like it's really needed, but then when you go through and do the math and there's very little impact, you say, okay, that's not a near-term priority. Also in prioritizing, if something can make a 40-person FTE change and it's not that exciting of a technology, you probably should go with that first and then come back to the more exciting technology. So anyway, all that to say, it allows us to have a conversation from the bottom up, looking at the flow chart, how we're moving the numbers around and how they're impacting the business. It also allows you to push the blame up. So one reason I wrote a failure report every month was I had already written up the solution. And many of you in here have done that, right? You're telling them, this is how we can make things better. And then they say, sure. But when you push the business rate up and said, this month, if you do this report every month, and you take the data and you plug it in every month and say, we failed to block 300 things, and I couldn't even detect at least twice that. And you push that back up the chain and they don't fire you, 10 minutes, no, possible. Then, actually almost done. Then you have a common conversation. But this is my favorite reason. This is very expensive to staff. Something happens, do food. Hire a really smart guy. If something comes in, he can deal with all the stuff. But this is so hard to teach. If you take just one block, one of those green blocks or orange blocks out of that big high-level flow chart and you create a smaller set of flow charts, here's how do you determine which hosts were touched during the event. So you have an infected machine, the guy gets a ticket, new guy, you know, hungry, young guy out of college, understands computer science well. He has a flow chart now, like I was coming into the Navy fixing aircraft. I have a flow chart. And you can go through and say, okay, I need to open up this console. Here's a screenshot of the console. Here's a tool. He gets training on that tool. He learns that process. He passes the ticket to the next guy in the flow chart. And all day long, he churns inside of this thing. And then growing him up to the next level, maturing him as a professional, you teach him another part of the process. And he becomes an expert in that process. And managers become managers of this. Not to mention, you can audit this. Did he do the steps? Did he run through the steps? Someone can go back and verify that they were done. And so in this way, this is why I think from a staffing perspective, it's very exciting because you're not born with 20 years worth of InfoSec knowledge. You can't learn the things you need to learn before you get your first job. And so documenting the process allows you to take a very excited guy and turn him into a powerful asset. And so with a few minutes left, make sure you pull down, I tweeted this out if you just want to go to @CharlesHerring on Twitter. That link's up there because I know there's some goofy characters in it. But it has the Visio in it. You can plug in your, and this deck is also in there. You can plug in your own metrics and use these different iterations. But I'll answer any questions, except where I was on September 15th, 2009. Yes? let's see. This one? This one? Oh, the verbiage? Yeah, this one?
For those colorful sentences, how much work can a sim can do, capable of impact those things?
A sim can do. Well, that's the hardest. So, let's see. So you could put user information into a sim. So you could store it in a sim. You could find it in a sim. It can't. Some sims like QRadar can store some amount of flow. So you could potentially query the flow. It can't do the detection of sandboxing the malware. So it can't do. So the green is a stretch for the sim. It's a stretch. It'd actually be very expensive to do that with a sim. It can't do the yellow. It can do the blue if some other data source is feeding it into the sim. And it can identify the user. So there's a great blog written by a great speaker that's in front of you right now called CISO Single Pane of Glass. It's my most popular blog entry, and I explain why this is very difficult to do in a sim. It's not the sim's fault necessarily, but you do need process. There will be better tools maybe in the next few years that will be able to automate a lot of this, but sims are very good at doing authentication failures, correlating vulnerabilities to exploit, so helping take multiple events and correlate their importance to give you a macro event, so they're decent at doing that. If the thing wasn't running, I would tell you that I hate sims, but but it is running, so I can't say that. But yeah, it requires a process. But honestly, when you go through and you have, I think the ideal tool set, if I had the money to buy all the tools I need to do this in a Fortune 500 company, you would have, it would still take, to get through the whole process, at least 8 man-hours on a single incident to actually do the investigation. You just can't take people out. And I mean, when you go back here, you know, where is it? To this piece, you know, the people are doing the execution, and the tools are assisting the people in that execution of the process. That's true in anything. It's true in Dearborn and in Detroit where we make cars. There's still people involved in the process, and there's machinery that helps with that. But currently, I think the best case on a full investigation is about 8 hours. It's the best we can get down to. Technology will get better, I hope, and we can get that down to an hour or so we can get back to playing Call of Duty. Any other questions? Oh, and some of you came in late. We're going to have drinks at the Whitney. The Whitney, that's a thing. I don't know what it is.
It's
but
4421 Woodward. It's about half a mile away.
Oh, they're free drink. They're free drinks. You're paying for them. You're paying for them. Okay. That's all I have to say. Any other questions? Man, always a lively flowchart bunch. Look at you guys, smiling faces on a Friday.
Can you put the last slide back up?
With the resources, yeah. Nope. No! Oh, no. No, I can't, Greg. How does this computer work? What's the process? I need a flowchart for getting back to that last thing. There you go. Let's see. There you go. There you go. Well, thank you very much. That's all I have, and hope to see you at the Whitney.